Have you ever wondered what could be so impactful it could set the world aflame? Imagine a day like any other in Sarajevo, Bosnia, on June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is visiting with his wife. In an instant, the peace is shattered. A Serbian nationalist assassinates the Archduke and his wife. This single act of violence was like a spark in a tinderbox, igniting what would become the first global conflict of the 20th century, World War I. But how did one assassination lead to a war involving many of the world's great powers? To understand this, we have to delve into the complex political landscape of the time. Europe was a web of alliances and treaties. Countries were bound together by promises of mutual defense and support. Austria-Hungary, shocked and angered by the assassination, declared war on Serbia. But Serbia was not alone. The country was part of a powerful alliance known as the Triple Entente, which included France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. These countries were obligated to come to Serbia's aid. On the other side, Austria-Hungary was part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Italy. These countries too were bound by mutual defense agreements. The stage was set for a conflict that would draw in nations from around the world. But the alliances alone don't explain the scale of the war. Other factors, such as intense nationalism, rivalries over colonial territories, and an escalating arms race, created a powder keg of tension. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark that lit this powder keg, and the explosion was felt around the world. In the weeks that followed the assassination, countries mobilized their armies, alliances were invoked, and diplomatic efforts failed to prevent the escalation. By the end of July, just 1 month after the assassination, the Great War had begun. And in this way, a single bullet ended up setting the stage for a global conflict. The world was aflame, and the fire of war would burn for more than 4 long, devastating years. So, how did a regional conflict escalate into a world war? Well, to understand this, we need to delve into the intricate web of alliances that existed among the European powers at the time. Europe was split into 2 main alliance blocs: the Triple Entente, comprising France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, and the Triple Alliance, made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the dominoes started to fall. The alliances kicked into gear, sweeping nations into a conflict that had initially seemed regional. But alliances alone didn't spark the global conflict. We must also take into account the role of imperialism and nationalism. European powers were locked in a fierce competition for overseas colonies. This race for dominance and wealth drove rivalries and created a simmering pot of tension. At the same time, intense nationalism was sweeping across the continent. Every nation believed in its superiority and right to power, creating a willingness to go to war to prove it. Adding fuel to the fire was the rampant militarism. The major powers were engaged in a dangerous arms race, building up their military forces and developing new weapons at a breakneck pace. This not only increased the capacity for war, but also the willingness. After all, what good were all those shiny new weapons if they weren't used? So you see, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was merely the spark that lit the fuse. The real explosives, the alliance system, imperialism, nationalism, and militarism, were already in place, creating an environment ripe for conflict. All it took was one spark, and the flames of war spread rapidly, fueled by these elements. As the dominoes fell, the stage was set for a war that would engulf nations across the globe. As the world held its breath, the war spread like wildfire. In the heart of Europe, 2 major fronts emerged, the Western and Eastern fronts. These fronts served as the main theaters of battle, characterized by their unique styles of warfare and the sheer scale of the conflict. On the Western Front, a line of trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. This marked the battleground between the Allies, primarily France and the UK, and the Central Powers, led by Germany. The Western Front became synonymous with trench warfare, a grueling and deadly form of combat. Soldiers lived, fought, and often died in these muddy trenches, facing not only enemy fire but also harsh conditions and disease. The landscape was marked by a wasteland of craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of once thriving towns and villages. The battles of the Somme and Verdun, among others, made the Western Front a grim testament to the war's brutality. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war was vastly different. Here, Germany and Austria-Hungary squared off against Russia and other Eastern European nations. The Eastern Front was marked by mobility. with sweeping advances and retreats across vast distances. The warfare was no less brutal, but it was a war of movement, unlike the static trench warfare of the West. Battles like Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes saw the Central Powers inflict devastating defeats on Russia, leading to significant territorial losses. However, the Eastern Front was not just a story of Central Powers' victories. Russia's sheer size and the harsh winters proved to be formidable obstacles. The logistical challenges of fighting on such a vast front often stretched the Central Powers' resources thin. In both fronts, the scale of the conflict was staggering. Millions of men were mobilized, fighting in battles that resulted in horrendous casualties, forever changing the face of warfare. This was a war unlike any other, a total war that consumed nations and societies. In a world at war, there were no bystanders, only participants. Indeed, the Western and Eastern fronts exemplified this, as every soldier, every citizen, and every nation felt the profound impact of this global conflict. The war would soon reach beyond the shores of Europe. As the conflict raged on, the United States, initially determined to remain neutral, found itself increasingly entangled in the turmoil. Two significant events would ultimately tip the scales towards American involvement. First, the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania by a German submarine in May 1915, which resulted in the tragic loss of more than 1,000 lives, including 128 Americans. This act of aggression ignited public outrage, turning the tide of American sentiment against Germany. Then came the infamous Zimmermann telegram in January 1917. Intercepted by British intelligence, the telegram revealed Germany's proposal of a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. This blatant violation of American neutrality was the final straw. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he urged. With the entry of the United States, the scale and scope of the war reached new heights. The year 1918 would prove to be pivotal. As the final year of World War I dawned, a beleaguered Germany, facing internal unrest and the impending arrival of fresh American forces, decided to gamble everything on a series of desperate offensives. These assaults, collectively known as the Spring Offensive, aimed to strike a decisive blow before the full weight of the United States could be brought to bear. The offensive began in March, spearheaded by elite stormtrooper units employing new infiltration tactics. These attacks were initially successful, pushing the Allies back and causing considerable disruption. However, the rapid advances overran German supply lines, and the exhausted troops could not sustain the momentum. Simultaneously, the Allied forces, now bolstered by the United States, began to counterattack. Known as the 100 Days Offensive, this series of attacks would turn the tide of the war irrevocably in favor of the Allies. The German lines began to crumble, and retreat turned into a rout. By October, the situation for the Central Powers had become untenable. Bulgaria signed an armistice at the end of September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in late October. Austria-Hungary, grappling with rising nationalist movements, agreed to an armistice at the start of November. Germany stood alone. Faced with imminent invasion, the German High Command, now effectively the country's government, had no choice but to seek an end to the fighting. On November 7th, a German delegation crossed the front lines in a car flying a white flag and was escorted to the Allied headquarters in the forest of Compiègne. The negotiations were brief and one-sided. The Allies were in no mood for leniency. On the 11th of November, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the armistice was signed. It was to take effect at 11 a.m. that same day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was finally over, but its echoes would resonate through the decades to come, shaping the world as we know it today. The war was over, but its shadow was long. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, marked the formal end to World War I. Its terms were harsh, particularly for Germany, which faced territorial losses, disarmament, and hefty reparations. The punitive nature of the treaty fostered resentment, laying the groundwork for the rise of Nazism and the outbreak of World War II. Yet the legacy of the Great War extends beyond the political landscape. It transformed the social fabric, introducing new roles for women and sparking technological advancements that forever altered warfare. Economically, it led to a shift in global power, with the United States emerging as a major player. Culturally, it inspired a generation of writers and artists who captured the disillusionment and trauma of a world at war. The Great War, as it was called, would leave a mark on history that still resonates today.